welcome to the 24 Hours to Doomsday podcast. My name's Tom Christie, I'm a writer based in central Scotland, and it's my pleasure today to be joined by Dr. Colin Barron, who is the author of 24 Hours to Doomsday, a contemporary thriller which he's going to be talking in more detail about today. So Colin, thanks for joining us. I would like to ask you first, if I might, about the title of your book, 24 Hours to Doomsday. Did you spend a lot of time devising the title, or were there other ones that you considered first?
Thank you, Tom. I think the title is important and should be short and punchy. When I was writing my previous novels, Operation Archer and Codename Enigma, I went through a large number of titles before settling on the ones I used. With this book, my working title was Drone Thriller, but I eventually settled on 24 Hours to Doomsday, after initially calling it 24 Hours Till Doomsday. When I did my research, I found that 24 Hours Till Doomsday has been used before as an episode title for various American TV series, but has never been used for a book or film. 24 Hours to Doomsday has never been used as a book or film title before, as far as I am aware. Another title I did briefly consider was Countdown to Zero, as this was appropriate for the missile launch, which forms a key part of the plot. However, I soon discovered that there already was a novel called Countdown to Zero, so I dropped that idea.
Now, once again, the book features a really striking cover by James Culver. How did this design come about?
My cousin James Culver is a graphic designer and has done the covers for my last few books. I used to be interested in art and graphic design myself, so I usually do a pencil sketch of my idea and send it to James, who then produces something which looks very professional. My original idea was to have 3 armed SAS troopers in full black kit with helmets, goggles and respirators standing in front of the Houses of Parliament, clutching their MP5 submachine guns. I also wanted the River Thames to feature in the cover because a large chunk of the book features the SAS, and there is a lot of action in central London, and the cover artwork reflects this.
In what ways would you say 24 Hours to Doomsday differs from your previous novels?
My previous 2 novels featured a mixture of World War II military action and science fiction. For my 3rd novel, though, I made the decision that everything that happened in the book had to be entirely plausible and fact-based. There was to be nothing that was supernatural or science fiction. There are a couple of scenes where the hero, Rick, dreams about his dead wife and talks to her, but I allowed this because that is part of normal psychological functioning. Bereaved people will often have dreams in which they communicate with a deceased partner. The most outlandish concept in the book is the notion that terrorists might carry explosive charges inside their abdomen. But that is not science fiction. I got that idea from a newspaper article I read years ago, which stated that the security services were worried that terrorists would use this very method to blow up airliners. The book even features 2 flashback chapters set during the Falklands War in 1982. But these depict real events that happened during the conflict, namely the SAS raid on the airstrip on Pebble Island on 15th May 1982 and the incident on 21st May when an SAS trooper shot down an Argentine Pucara aircraft with a Stinger missile. So these 2 chapters depict actual historical events with considerable accuracy. The only change I made was the introduction of the character of Trooper Jack Fernscale, Rick's father.
Yes, that leads me on to another question. A lot of writing courses out there stress the importance of structure in a novel. How did you approach this aspect of your novel writing?
With my last novel, Codename Enigma, I used a template called The Hero's Journey. This was devised by author Joseph Campbell and is the basic structure behind many famous books and films, including the original 1977 Star Wars movie, Die Hard, The Wizard of Oz, Raiders of the Lost Ark, and many others. If you want to learn more about this, then just listen to my podcast on the writing of Codename Enigma. With this latest book, though, I took a completely different approach in which I just wrote the first chapter and then asked myself the question, what happens next? And then repeated the process. And my inspiration for the first chapter came from an American author called Jerry Jenkins, who does a lot of podcasts and blogs about writing. I have studied a lot of them. And one day I came across an idea of his. He said a very good way to start a novel is with an opening chapter in which the hero loses everything. And I mean everything. Their whole world falls apart in seconds. So I came up with the idea of opening my novel with the protagonist Rick enjoying the happiest day of his life. He's just married a beautiful woman called Laura, and they're on board a riverboat heading down the Thames to Richmond. Then the boat is hit by a terrorist drone. Laura is badly burned and Rick is thrown overboard with a broken arm and fractured ribs. The chapter ends with Rick sinking to the riverbed, too badly injured to swim to the surface, and with his new wife lying on the deck, apparently dying. What happens next? Well, you'll have to read the book to find out. I would describe that chapter ending as the mother of all cliffhangers. So from that point on, I was writing the book one chapter at a time without an overall structure in mind. I really was flying by the seat of my pants. For example, in one of the early chapters, we learn that the terrorists have a master plan called Operation Armageddon. But at that stage in the writing process, I wasn't sure what Operation Armageddon was going to be. Similarly, the idea that there was a mole inside the government feeding information to the terrorists was something that occurred to me as I was writing that chapter. The basic structure of all stories is the disturbance of the status quo and its resolution. The protagonist has a goal, and as many obstacles as possible have to be placed in the hero's path to prevent achievement of that goal. The readers have to be kept in a state of suspense, not knowing until the last paragraph of the book whether the hero has succeeded or failed, or even been killed. In fact, I had two different endings in mind for the book. In one ending, Rick survives. In the other, he's shot dead by a sniper. I'm not going to tell you what ending was used. You'll have to read the book to find out. Though although I wasn't aware of a structure to the book, in the final product there is a definite structure. It is as though my conscious mind was unaware of any structure, but my subconscious made sure there was one. As Dr. Milton Erickson once said, there's a part of you that knows more about you than you do.
Now, your new book has a very powerful theme, and of course that is revenge. Would you like to say a little bit more about your employment of that particular topic?
One of the themes of this book is Rick's desire to get revenge for the death of his wife. Now that is not a new idea, but it is a very popular one which goes back to biblical times. Take the Death Wish films, for example. I think it's fair to say that they were hugely popular with audiences, even though the critics hated them. Michael Winner, who directed the first 3 Death Wish films, always said that audiences like a film in which the bad guys get properly done in. And believe me, in 24 Hours to Doomsday, the bad guys do get properly done in. The first 4 Death Wish films made a lot of money, and the format has been copied countless times. For example, the John Wick films, Harry Brown, which starred Michael Caine, the Taken series with Liam Neeson, and many others. And of course, people forget that the popular TV series The Avengers was given this title because in the first series, the lead character, Dr. David Keel, played by Ian Hendry, was avenging the death of his girlfriend. After the first series, Steed's character became more prominent, David Keel was absent, and they didn't actually do any avenging, but the series was still called The Avengers because it's a great title. Revenge is a basic human emotion. I'm sure almost everyone listening to this podcast has suffered at the hands of criminals at some point in their lives. Their house has been burgled, their car stolen, or even just vandalised, or someone in the family has been assaulted. And when you experience crime like this, it is quite normal to feel a desire for revenge, to cause physical harm to the perpetrator. Most people don't get a chance to get even with people who wrong them, because we live in a civilised society in which such actions are forbidden. But we all feel a desire for revenge on many occasions in our lives, and I think that is why books and films dealing with this subject are so popular and so engrossing.
What kind of research did you find yourself doing for this book? Was it necessary to get a lot of background information?
There's an old adage that you should always write about what you know, and that was certainly the case with this book. I've always been interested in military history and technology, and my specialist sub-interests include rockets and missiles, the various Middle East wars, the 1982 Falklands conflict, and the SAS. And that is the reason that all these topics feature heavily in this book. I have the same approach to research as the late TV writer Brian Clemens. I tend to write my first draft of any chapter using just the information I already have in my head. Then, before I rewrite the chapter, I now know exactly what facts I need to check. One invaluable resource was the DVD set of a 2003 BBC TV series called SAS Survival Secrets. This featured two ex-SAS soldiers, Sergeant Eddie Stone and Trooper John McAleese, talking about SAS weapons, tactics and jargon. I also re-watched DVDs of the ITV series Ultimate Force, which starred Ross Kemp, and I've also read a few books by Chris Ryan and Andy McNabb. The 1982 Lewis Collins movie Who Dares Wins was also an inspiration. Thus, I acquired knowledge about the weapons, jargon and tactics used by the SAS and incorporated this information in the book. For example, the SAS don't talk about miles to a target, they use the word clicks, with clicks being a kilometre. Another example of military jargon is the egg banjo, which is mentioned in the book. The egg banjo is nothing more than a fried egg sandwich. It's called a banjo because when you eat one, the egg yolk tends to squirt onto your uniform jacket, and you then make a strumming motion with your hand to remove the yolk, and that's supposed to look like a banjo player playing their instrument, hence the name.
So how important would you say cliffhangers are to the books that you write?
They're very important in this type of book. You want to keep the reader interested, and one way of doing this is with an end of chapter cliffhanger. What you do is you introduce a problem at the end of a chapter, and then you don't solve it until the beginning of the next chapter. Sometimes you can even insert a whole chapter on a different topic between the introduction of a cliffhanger and its resolution. For example, chapter 1 of my latest book ends with a cliffhanger which is not resolved until the beginning of chapter 3, as chapter 2 is a flashback chapter.
And how important would you say you find the use of grammar and syntax in your writing? Do you think in a broader context that's indicative of rules in novel writing generally?
Well, when I was at school, Tom, I was taught traditional grammar, but I think a lot of these rules are now archaic and can be disregarded. Let me give you an example. In traditional writing, there is a rule which states that it is wrong to repeat the same word or a similar sounding word in the same paragraph. So, for example, you wouldn't write, "The missile was fired from the ship," "The missile climbed high into the sky," and then "the missile hit the aircraft." Using the principle of elegant variation, you might change this to "The missile was fired from the ship, the rocket climbed high into the sky, and then the projectile hit the aircraft." Now, that is what is known as elegant variation. Now, newspaper journalists are notorious for following this rule slavishly, and this can lead to problems. Like a very famous example in The Guardian some years ago, when a journalist wrote something like this: "Snow is heading for Britain. The white frosty stuff will start falling on Sunday morning." You see, the journalist didn't want to repeat the word snow because he thought it was bad writing. Unfortunately, in the English language, there is no alternative word for snow. However, sometimes this rule of elegant variation can be broken. The best known example would probably be from Charles Dickens' classic novel A Tale of Two Cities, where he writes, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times." And in my latest book, I have also broken this so-called rule. For example, there is a passage where I wrote this: "If only he'd evacuated London. If only he'd informed Sage. If only. If only." Also, at school, you were probably taught to write using whole sentences which have a subject, object, and verb. But sentence fragments can sometimes be more effective than complete sentences, as they are more punchy. If you look on the internet, you will see many of these so-called rules of writing. Don't start your book with an action sequence. Don't start your book by describing the weather. Don't have whole chapters about a character's backstory. Actually, I think chapters about a character's backstory can be very effective because they are a story embedded within a story, which is a well-known hypnotic technique as used by Dr. Milton Erickson. They keep the reader engrossed. As Somerset Maugham once said, "There are 3 rules to writing a novel." Unfortunately, no one knows what they are.
And do you feel that your previous experience as a medical doctor and then as a hypnotherapist has helped your writing?
Very much so. If we take my medical background first, this has helped me to be accurate about medical issues. 2 examples I would give are gunshot wounds and drug drinks. In action movies, a bullet wound to the arm or leg is not a problem, as long as it does not fracture a bone. Then it becomes just a flesh wound. All you have to do is remove the bullet and stitch up the wound, and within minutes the hero is ready for action. In reality, a bullet wound like that would take months to heal and would require constant wound care, physiotherapy and rehabilitation. I've reflected that reality in my book. At one point, Rick is wounded and takes almost 3 months to recover. Another thing that annoys me is the idea that drugged drinks work instantly. In the Bond films Dr. No and The Living Daylights, Bond is given a drugged drink and falls unconscious within a couple of minutes. In reality, the only drugs that work instantly are those that are given intravenously or by inhalation. A drug given intramuscularly will also work fairly quickly, usually within minutes. However, an orally administered drug can take up to an hour to work. Viagra is a good example, as it has to be taken an hour before intercourse. To move on to hypnotherapy, when we read a good book, we go into a hypnotic trance. And one way we can induce a trance is by describing a scene using as many senses as possible. For example, At the start of chapter 2, I have a scene set inside the troop compartment of a Sea King helicopter. I've described this using as many senses as possible. The sound of the engines and the whirring rotor blades, all the various smells, gun oil, bad breath, sweat, the almond-like aroma of plastic explosive, the cold feeling of the metal interior as condensation runs down the perspex windows, all the different colours inside the cabin, that kind of thing. That is very similar to what we do in hypnotherapy. One way you can put people into trance is by describing a scene using all the senses: sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. A similar principle applies to describing the physical appearance of characters. It is not always necessary to do this, but if you do, you must do it as soon as the character appears in the book. Because if you don't have a physical description of them initially, but then, for example, describe them as being bald 6 chapters later, that may conflict with the way the reader has originally pictured them.
Your previous novels have featured a number of references to the James Bond series of films and books. Do you think that Bond was an influence on your latest novel?
Very much so. The Bond contains a number of tropes inspired by Bond movies. I've even used an idea which was considered for a Bond movie but never used. To explain further, when production designer Sid Kane was scouting locations for the film On Her Majesty's Secret Service, he considered having Blofeld's lair in an old Maginot Line fort. That idea was never used because they eventually found the mountaintop location that we all remember from the film. However, one of the 2 villains' lairs which feature in my book is a Maginot Line fort, so I employed an unused idea from a Bond movie.
And finally, do you think this book will lead to any sequels, or have we seen the last of SAS hero Rick Fernscale?
Well, it all depends on whether he's still alive at the end of the book, doesn't it? But if he does survive, then I think we may indeed see further Rick Fernscale adventures.
Well, Colin, thank you very much for taking the time today to discuss your new novel. I'm sure anyone who has had the chance to pick up a copy will be highly entertained by the adventures within, which are realistic, contemporary, and never anything other than exciting and fast-paced. Thank you very much, Colin.
Thank you very much, Tom.